good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the breakout sessions this morning and our presenters that we had this morning. Please keep eating, but try not to clank too much, okay, on the plates and stuff, but please continue to enjoy your lunch. We have a very special treat for you here, a very special individual who kind of came into our life a year ago when we asked the Ford Foundation to help with the summit. They were our first funders from the Ford Foundation last year for the first summit, and then again this year. And the individual who stepped forward on that is the present president of the Ford Foundation, and that's Darren Walker, who is here with us today. We thank you, Darren.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
So Darren Walker is a Texan out of the University of Texas, got his bachelor's degree in Austin and his Juris Doctor, which means he's a lawyer, but don't hold that against him. The University of Texas has given him their Distinguished Alumnus Award, their highest honor of the University of Texas, in 2016, Time magazine, then and has since dubbed him as one of the 100 most influential persons in the world. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the recipient of 13 honorary degrees. As I said, he's president of the Ford Foundation. And I would recommend to all of you here to Google or Safari or whatever your search engine is, and Google Darren Walker Disability Letter that he wrote on September 16th of last year. It is phenomenal. And then Google the Nancy Hanks lecture by Darren Walker that was this spring, and it's also phenomenal. So we are just proud and honored to have you here, Darren, and to have you and the Ford Foundation as one of our partners in this great endeavor to increase employment of people with disabilities. So thank you for everything.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Now, so again, as I said, you've been a supporter from the very beginning. For those, a lot of people here from around the globe, can you just tell us what is the mission of the Ford Foundation, and how do you see that kind of intersecting with the disability rights movement in general, and maybe the whole, what we're about here, which is jobs and employment for people with disabilities. So tell us about the mission of the Ford Foundation.
Well, thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. I feel so fortunate to be with you, to be invited to spend some time speaking with someone I admire greatly, someone who is really a reminder of what great public service is. Tom Harkin, during his time in public service, made us all proud and was at the forefront of so many important social change movements that widened the circle of inclusion. And I'm just so grateful to you, Tom, and grateful to Andy and your team who have put on this summit, but do far more than just convene and bring us together. It's what you do between the summits to keep us focused on the issue of disability and the rights of people with disabilities. At the Ford Foundation, our work is really centered on addressing inequality in the world in all of its forms, not just economic inequality, because inequality is more than just about economics. It's about culture. It's about the way in which we see each other. It's about identity. All of these things drive why we have inequality and why inequality is growing in the world. For me, my own journey to understand the rights of people with disabilities, as we look at the question of inequality, was something that was actually quite transformational, because I, like most people, must profess my own ignorance to the issue. When I became president of the foundation, we commissioned many experts to help us understand inequality in the world. And at the end of that process, what was the result was a great amount of work around the inequalities as it relates to all sorts of people and identities. But what was missing was how inequality manifests in communities composed of people with disabilities. And that indeed was a great oversight that reflected our own both institutional bias and our personal ignorance. And even as I learned, even those of us who were not ignorant, because, for example, at the Ford Foundation, there are many people who themselves have a disability of one sort, or have a family member, or live in a community where people with disabilities are visible, and yet, as an institution, we resolved to work on reducing inequality in the world and overlooked one of the populations who is most impacted by inequality. And so the journey for the foundation has been one of, I think, honest interrogation, of reflection on how we have our own implicit bias, even as a liberal, progressive foundation. I think we have failed on this front, and it has really been with the help of people like Judy Heumann, my colleague Darren Khan, who some of you know, and many of you in this room who have been consulted and have advised us as we have really, I think, reconsidered some of our grant making. It's made it possible for us now to really put disability rights in an integrated framework of all of the other rights work, because we do work on the rights of people of color, the women, lower caste in India, LGBT. I mean, there are many ways in which we understand how inequality manifests, the intersectional ways in which it does. I mean, I imagine, of course, what it is like to be, I'm a black gay man. I have an understanding of what it is like to be marginalized or invisible or discriminated against. But I can only imagine what it would be like if I also had a disability that I was dealing with at the same time that I'm dealing with the discrimination I might face as a gay African American man. What if I were in a wheelchair? What if I were blind? These are the realities that many people with disabilities live. There is not, you don't live your life in a silo. You actually live your life in a very intersectional way. And so for us as a foundation to be here is a journey. We are far from having figured it all out, but I think we are committed to be on the journey and to benefit from opportunities like this and opportunities working with many of the new grantees who have come into the portfolio of the foundation and who are teaching us every day. And as I said, having Judy Heumann join us as a senior fellow this year has given us Judy, what can I say? Has given us Judy. And for those of you who know Judy, you know what that means. It means that you have someone who is there to help you be better, to help you be more excellent. Because I don't think that we can be an excellent foundation. I don't think we can pursue our mission and leave the rights of people with disabilities off the table.
Well, thank you very much, Darren. That is very profound. And thank you for your personal leadership on this. I mean, I can't tell you all what I've been able to observe and hear through my sources from what Darren Walker has done at Ford starting last year. You mentioned the journey that you're on. It's a journey, as I understand it, to integrate disability policy across all that you do. That's what's so important, because so many entities, whether it's a foundation or a private business, they tend to think of, they need a narrow sort of sector on disability. We'll take a sector and we'll get some people with disabilities and we'll put them there and then we're done with it. What you have done and what I hear about is this idea of bringing disability policy into everything that you do. So can you talk a little bit more about, you've been doing that, what are you learning? What could other funders, other businesses perhaps pick up on this so that they start thinking also like you have done about integrating it in everything you do?
Well, I think that what I don't want is for people to perceive that to work on issues around disability rights, that it's somehow a burden. Because that's actually the way people thought about, including many people. I mean, I was reading recently some of the internal documents at the Ford Foundation in the 1960s before we ever had an African-American grant maker. There were no African-American grant makers at the Ford Foundation in 1967.
Wow.
And there was an internal set of memoranda that went around that it made it seem as if to hire a black person to be a grant maker would be a burden to the foundation. That the foundation would have to do all of these things, and boy, oh boy, it's going to be so hard. We need a mind shift that is the same kind of mind shift that says, stop looking at people as deficits. So hiring black people is not a deficit activity. It is an activity towards excellence. Because if you define excellence as being the best you can be and having everyone inside the circle, it allows you then to say, what separates us from excellence?
That's right.
And what separates us from excellence is that we have left out a large part of our society in terms of human capital, human potential, and the impact that people can have if you include them. And so for us, what it has meant that we have interrogated our own practices. And in all honesty, some of what we have found has been both depressing and also revealing. Depressing in that we would like to think that we are inclusive, but we're not as inclusive as we can be. We have a human resources office that has thought of itself as being in compliance, being a best in class, all of these terms. And yet, we don't have in our hiring process the same degree of ambition to make sure that we hire women, people of color, LGBT, etc. We don't have that same aspiration as potently for people with disabilities. That's one example. If you look at our communications, we have a very extensive website, a very sophisticated communications capacity, and yet we don't have the basic captioning on videos on our website. I mean, basic things that anyone who would be willing to interrogate themselves would see. And so we've brought in a consultant who is doing a full 360 of the organization, from our hiring practices to the actual facility. The Ford Foundation headquarters was not, in many ways, even ADA compliant. I mean, at a minimum, we were.
Yeah.
But we actually, if you entered, for those of you who know our building on 42nd Street, there are two entrances. There's an entrance on 42nd and an entrance on 43rd. The entrance on 43rd is into our garden and then up to the ground level. It's not accessible to a person in a wheelchair, or, well, to a person who even has a difficult time walking. I mean, even that basic thing we have allowed for 50 years. You have to go around all the way to 2nd Avenue and around the block to go into 43rd Street. And then even on 43rd Street, there is an 18-inch drop between the front door and the front of the building. And so we have, as we are now renovating the building, we are thinking about how do we not just do the minimum, because it isn't about compliance. Because compliance doesn't make you excellent. Compliance doesn't make you best in class. You've got to do more than that. And so for us, it's been a real revealing. It has revealed a lot about ourselves, about our rhetoric, about our liberal self-righteousness, about our sense that, well, we're progressive at the Ford Foundation. Actually, we're progressive for some people. We are going to be progressive for everyone, and that's the goal.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. You can see why I'm so enthused about Darren Walker.
Well, 2 or 3 years from now, you can call me back and see if it's wonderful. Because I think one of the things that we're also really good at is the rhetoric. We're really good at rhetoric. And I think one of the reasons, you know, you have grantees and you have people like Judy and you, is because then you have to be held accountable, right? Because when you have the same way our grantees around women's rights hold us accountable. I mean, it's not that only that we give them money, we actually expect them to hold us accountable.
Sure.
And to say, all right, how many women do you have working at the Ford Foundation? How many women do you have in leadership positions? I mean, these are the kinds of things that now that we have a portfolio and are supporting a community, that a couple of years from now, if we haven't fixed some of these things, I'm going to be in hot water.
Well,
and we don't want me to be in hot water, so
but just keep Judy on it. Okay?
I know.
I just told Darren Walker earlier, as you know, Judy is now a fellow at the Ford Foundation. And we all know Judy is one of the smartest, brightest, most capable individuals. How come I lost sight of where the heck she is? Oh, over here. Anyway, so we all know Judy Human. So I told Darren, I said, look, I can tell you from experience, Judy's been a friend of mine since the 80s, a really close friend of mine since the 80s, but that has not prevented her from putting her foot in the middle of my back and pushing me at various times. And so be prepared, okay? But as you said, people like Judy have our back. They have our back on this. So, but again, what you've done is filtering out. I hear about it.
But I want to talk to your second part of the question about philanthropy.
Yes.
And why large foundations like the Ford Foundation are so absent from the conversation, which is an indictment of all of us, including my own institution, that we have for these years done our work, our missions around poverty reduction, improving the criminal justice system, I mean, all sorts of things that we work on, child welfare, education, that we have done our work absent the voices and perspectives of people with disabilities is a real indictment of philanthropy. I think there are many, many well-intentioned foundations, and in fact many individual family foundations who are actually more engaged than the large institutions. And I think it is in part because of the way in which you describe, we see these issues as additive, right? So how can you be a health foundation and not work on disabilities? How can you be a human rights foundation and not work on disabilities? How can you be an education foundation and not work on disabilities? How can you be a public space urban planning foundation and not work on disability? And yet we do, and it is in part because the people in charge suffer from the same myopia, the same implicit bias, the same ignorance that I have suffered from, and that most people suffer from. And so I think it is the reason I'm so inspired and why I got off a plane from London to come here is because your voices are essential to change that paradigm. Because institutions, large foundations, are privileged institutions. And privileged institutions and privileged people, in spite of what we say, we actually really don't like change. And we really don't like being made uncomfortable. And we really don't like being called on our own hypocrisy. And so just as in the 1960s with women and African Americans and Latinos, and in the 90s and with LGBT, this didn't happen because people inside these institutions decided one day, oh, we want to support LGBT rights. No one inside a big foundation came to work one day and said, I want to create a program on marriage equality. I mean, there were a couple of people, but there was not the wide groundswell you see today of all of these foundations who 20 years ago wouldn't even put on a website that they were funding LGBT issues. Today that are at the forefront. It took people outside holding them accountable for their rhetoric, for our rhetoric. So you want to build a more inclusive America, and you're not looking at us? And we're invisible to your strategy? We're invisible? I read your mission statement. Your mission statement can't be achieved without including us. That is what we need to be told.
Wow. 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 I hope more philanthropies hear that message. I hope that they are paying attention to what you're doing. That's very profound. One thing I did want to discuss with you, with all of the people here in this room, is that it's been my experience through the years that disability rights movements, people involved in disability rights, for various and sundry reasons, tend to, well, how am I trying to say, try to just be them by themselves, and instead of trying to reach out and get other groups involved with them. A lot of reasons for that insularity of disability groups around the country and around the globe. But you and the Ford Foundation, you work with a lot of groups. You do a lot of stuff with groups. Any thoughts, advice, suggestions for the disability community to get out of that shell? that type of thing.
Sure.
How
Well, I think broadly speaking, I'm not so sure it's as much staying in your shell as it is recognizing the discrimination that exists in the larger community and the ways in which invisibility manifests in a society. I think if we were to look at just the traditional human rights framework, to my mind, it is really surprising that we have human rights funders, human rights tables, and disabilities is not at the forefront of those agendas. And I don't think that's necessarily because the disability rights community has sort of stayed to itself. I think it's in large part because the human rights community has defined things to not include people with disabilities.
True.
And so I think what we need to do is to reset human rights and reset the ways in which we think about human rights frameworks. In the area of employment, I think that there are many advocacy organizations for employment for many communities. And there has to be, it's essential that we take a more integrated approach, that we take a more intersectional approach to the question of work. Because in this moment we are in, the very question of the future of work is profound. Mm-hmm. We are all unsettled by AI, by artificial intelligence, by robotics, by technological innovation that is calling into question just how much labor the world will need.
That's right.
And so all of these questions are happening now. And we're searching for answers. And I think many of the organizations working on these questions do not have the perspective of disability rights or people with disabilities at those tables with the labor economists, with the workforce specialists, with the social scientists, who are, the technologists who are thinking about these questions. And so for me, it's going to be essential that people, so for example, right now, we need some really powerful research, or at least the kinds of public dialogue that ask these questions from the perspective of people with disabilities, right? Because I've seen lots of research, of essays, of dialogue on talk shows, in all of the journals, The Nation, The Atlantic, The New Yorker. I mean, all of these journals are writing about these questions about work and employment and whether or not people are going to actually need a universal basic income and whether or not artificial intelligence will render, 40% of the labor force surplus. I mean, all of these questions are happening. Wouldn't it be great to have some of those questions asked, some of that discourse informed by people with disabilities, people who are speaking from the perspective of, we at the foundation were just a part of a large effort of gathering in Silicon Valley for the care sector, the people who are the home health aides, the people who care for our parents as they age, the people who will care for us, there weren't any people who care and work in independent living facilities, in communities of independent living for people with disabilities. There weren't any people there who have that kind of experience. Well, there should have been. I mean,
should have had Marka Bristow there.
Right, and exactly. and we need her to be writing articles.
Right.
We need her to say, wait a minute, Stanford Social Innovation Review, you're publishing all of this stuff about Silicon Valley and work and how it's what about this important population? Hey, Atlantic magazine, you got a whole beat on inequality. Every edition, there's something about inequality. There's never been anything about people with disabilities.
Amazing.
Why aren't we doing that?
Amazing.
I mean, we need to be doing that.
Yeah. Well, that's your challenge to all of the
yes,
people
it's
here.
our challenge to all of us. It's my challenge to my colleagues as we think about the kinds of work that we fund and the organizations that we support and how we encourage them to be visible.
Yes.
I mean, part of this is about being visible.
Yes.
Because, you know, without that, people are happy to go on with the world the way it is.
Boy, that is so on point. We were just talking earlier about ADAPT and Bob Kafka, whom some of you know who I'm talking about. And I always referred to ADAPT as sort of the Marines of the disability rights movement. They hit the beach first, and they took most of the firepower, but they were the ones that brought to the public consciousness what was going on. When they laid under the wheels of the Greyhound buses back in the 70s and 80s, people said, what's that all about? So you're right. I'm not saying you all have to be Bob Kafka's and get arrested 100 and some times. You don't have to do that. But you do have to write the articles. You do have to be out there prodding and pushing and getting that awareness. I think it all harkens back to what you said in the beginning. Entities like businesses and non-for-profits and stuff tend to internalize. They don't change of their own. No. They need that outside input coming in. So that's a great challenge that you've given all of the people here. One last thing I just wanted to cover with you is, and you touched on it briefly, a lot of people tend to think of a person with a disability as someone with a disability. Either physical disability, intellectual disability, developmental disability, or combination thereof. But a lot of times, people with disabilities are members of other groups. Exactly. LGBT, women, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples. I just, again, was brought to me, talking about ignorance, my own ignorance. We have really not done enough in the disability rights movement for Native Americans, who also have huge numbers of people with disabilities on the reservations, and we're not reaching out to them. So again, I just exploring with you about understanding how people with disabilities working in these other groups, how do we connect with them? How do we not just address them as persons with disabilities, but get the other groups also involved? Well, for example, what I'm saying is, in the women's rights movement or racial, ethnic efforts in this country and other places, well, they'll have people with disabilities too.
Absolutely, but we have to ask them, we have to engage with them to demonstrate that this matters, right? Because institutions like the Ford Foundation or government institutions or large corporations, we send signals about what matters in our society. Whether we like it or not, we have a capacity to influence. And so something that we are doing under the leadership of my colleague Naran Khan, the Ford Foundation makes 1,600 grants a year around the world. We have, as a part of that process, a request for information from applicants. And there's everyone in the field, because Ford was the first to do it, and not everyone appreciates it, but it is our diversity tables. So if you are an opera company or you are a Native American NGO, it doesn't matter. You have to tell the Ford Foundation, and you will be assessed on how diverse you are, starting with your board, your staff, and we ask very specific questions. We have had no question about people with disabilities. And Naran said, well, here's how we get people to figure this out, because it has worked in other areas. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of organizations who who have responded and said, because we do an assessment and we go back to the organization and we say, we're considering you for a grant, but we want you to understand that if you would wish to be a longer-term grantee of the foundation, you will need to improve the number of women and people of color on your board, or whatever it is. And it has absolutely had impact.
Sure.
And we send a signal to applicants when you go on our website and you know that you're going to be asked about those things. And if you're not willing to engage, don't apply. I mean, just don't apply. And the same thing with government, as you well know from your time in public service. When the federal government says, or state or local government says, we expect you to have an affirmative program to include. When a corporation says, we are going to hire, fill in the blank, veterans, whoever it is, that sends a signal to the culture. And so for us, we have to think about how all of our institutions can do that. Because that's how we will institute change over time. Anything short of that, anything, oh, well, let's voluntarily talk about it for another 10 years. I mean, we are wonderful at admiring the problem, but actually implementing, executing solutions, we fall short.
Wow, that is so, well, I can speak about government. That's absolutely true about government. I can speak to that.
Oh, it's true. But I remember when I was at a law firm, it was all of a sudden, because the clients started saying, the corporate clients started saying, you cannot show up with a team of white male lawyers on our transactions. You've got to have women. You've got to. When the client started to demand,
that's right.
Then the firms, we have to actually change our recruiting practices, because our recruiting practices are generating basically all white men.
Right.
At our law firm. Sure. Well, our clients aren't going to continue to do business with us, call us for business anymore, if we don't start hiring women. If we don't start, so until clients start to say, so until the Ford Foundation says to our vendors, to our grantees, we expect you to have a plan for inclusion of people with disabilities, and until IBM and PepsiCo and Uber and these folks aren't doing that, till they're doing that, we're not going to see change, which is why we need you all and people in this community and beyond, because it shouldn't be just people with disabilities advocating for people with disabilities.
That's right.
It should be people who, again, it's just as, you know, I was on a panel with Gloria Steinem the other day, and she said, you know, it shouldn't be just women who are outraged about what this sexual harassment and all of these horrible things that have been reported that have been happening to women. And if you talk to any woman, they go, duh, of course. I mean, of course this is, but as Gloria said, it shouldn't be just men should be outraged.
Of course. Yeah.
I mean, about what's happening. And so it's the same thing with this issue. It shouldn't be just people with disabilities who are advocating to say we should be changing.
That's right, exactly. And that, another salient point there is that that has to do with design and building. That we have found that when you bring people with disabilities in at the beginning, when you're designing, whether it's platforms for software or buildings, or you mentioned Uber, transportation. Do you know, if I go to London today, every cab I hail in London is fully accessible. Mm-hmm. Not so in Washington, D.C., or New York City, or Chicago, but that's why I mean, if you do it from the beginning, universal design helps everyone. So those who are not disabled ought to be demanding that, because you never know. You're an accident away, an illness away, a child with a disability away, and needing that kind of accessibility. So we, as you said, we have to be involved, not just the disability community, but those who are in not only I don't want to just say positions like we have, or I had, and you have, but just everyday people have got to be involved in this, in their educational systems, in their work life, have to be involved in pushing the envelope on this. Lastly, I want to say, again, I must admit that our focus of the summits is a little bit narrow. It's on jobs.
Yes, it is.
It's jobs and careers and self-employment. I've often thought it's a cruel irony to have early childhood education for kids with disabilities, and then to fully integrate them in schools, and then to have special IEP programs and all the supporting things. And then there's no hope for them later to have a meaningful job or opportunity later in life. So that's why I wanted to focus on employment and jobs and careers. And so we come together, and a lot of us dream about this. We dream about what that future is going to be like in terms of accessibility to meaningful, not menial, meaningful employment. And so you're a dreamer. So I'm going to.
Well, I think again, the point here is not to make the aspiration of people with disabilities some special burden. Everyone knows that in our society, work is an essential part of human dignity for an adult.
That's right.
We all deserve to live in this country with dignity. Our culture is a culture where work is so essential to one's dignity. And we see that with people who are fully able-bodied who lose their job and who lose their dignity in the process. I mean, the loss of that dignity is what drives hopelessness and anger.
That's right.
It's part of what has given us this moment we're in this country.
Yeah.
That sense of some people's loss of dignity and their sense of hopelessness and despair, which has driven them, some of them, to a point of just sheer desperation and a sense of doing things that are not even in their own interests.
That's true.
But out of nothing but hopelessness, fear, and anger, they are willing to drive us off a cliff.
That's right.
Because why not?
Yeah.
And so my point is, people with disabilities have been living with this forever in the terms of work. And the aspiration is no different than my aspiration or your aspiration.
That's right.
And therefore, if we want this to be a country where people live with dignity, we should have opportunities for work.
That's right.
For everyone.
That's right.
And so we have to think about, just as we think about people coming out of prison, right? I mean, so we've got a major initiative at the foundation thinking about how to help people who have basically been stripped of their dignity, because if anyone knows anything about our criminal justice system in this country, it is designed to dehumanize you and to strip you of your dignity. And so how do you think about entering the workforce? I mean, how do you think about coming out of Sing Sing after 10 years and getting a job? So how we think about that population, though, and saying, but they deserve work. They deserve an opportunity. Well, everybody deserves an opportunity for work. And just as we're thinking about what are the interventions we need, because this population is worthy of work, worthy of dignity, but they are going to need some particular support and intervention. And as a society, if we want them to be productive, we have to support that. We should be thinking about a broader population of people that way.
And they have talents.
Oh, my goodness, this is the point. I mean, I guess I don't even mention that because that's self-evident. I mean, it's clear that the talent and the human capital and capacity is there. Is there a willingness to see that potential?
Well, our goal that I asked people here to maybe assume or to pick up on was to double the rate of employment of people with disabilities globally in 10 years. Set a goal and then start to moving in that direction.
And I think that is an amazing aspiration. We need to get the data.
Yep.
We need to understand what the gap is.
Yep.
And then we need to hold institutions and government accountable to get to that goal.
Right.
And I think, and that is doable. That is doable. That is doable by this organization. That is doable by you, Andy, and your organization. And it's doable by the UN. And I think just the same way we are thinking right now about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
And everywhere I go, there's a conversation, whether I was just in Geneva or just in London, just in Houston, there's a conversation. There should be this conversation when people are talking about jobs.
I can't think of a better note on which to end this. And you can see why I'm so enthused about Darren Walker and his leadership. You are a transformational leader, and I'm not just blowing hot air at you. I mean it.
You're very nice.
So thank you very, very much. Let's hear it. Come on, let's give it up for Darren Walker.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Wow. And
So Tom,
amazing. Wow.
Tom, everybody in the room is now going to want to meet with Darren Walker, and I know that he has to catch a train. So
yes.
I'm asking everybody to please respect his need to get out of here. Darren, let me try to speak for the whole room. You know, many people in this room have been working on this issue for decades, including our leader. You are the voice that many of us have been waiting for a long time, and to hear it coming from the Ford Foundation is very powerful. To hear it coming from a gay black man is very powerful, and just know that we love you and we appreciate your leadership, and we will do everything in our power to lift up your leadership on these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to transition now to report outs, and the goal as we transition, and we'll take a break, but the goal as we transition is really to hear big ideas that happened in the breakouts that can point us in a direction around